The air inside the hall was electric, the kind of tension that clung to every breath. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and a restless crowd waited for the night to unfold. The stage was set not just for another political event, but for a moment that would mark itself into history. Then, with the eyes of the nation watching, the insult came. A sharp, cutting remark hurled across the stage, dripping with arrogance and designed to humiliate. It was the kind of comment meant to belittle, the kind of jab that made the crowd gasp and whisper in disbelief. For a brief second, the room seemed to stop. Every head turned, every camera zoomed in, and the entire country felt the weight of that sentence. The words hung heavy in the air, cruel and dismissive, daring anyone to respond. This was not a debate of ideas, it was a performance of power, a spectacle where one man attempted to stand taller by forcing another down. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between outrage and anticipation, knowing something extraordinary was about to follow. But beneath the insult, beneath the sneer and the smug grin of the man who threw it, there was a silence more powerful than words. The silence of the one who received it. Calm, collected, unshaken. A figure who had faced worse storms before, a figure who carried the weight of millions who had been spoken down to, dismissed, and underestimated. That silence, that measured stillness, was not weakness. It was the warning of a storm preparing to break. Across living rooms, on phones and screens from coast to coast, viewers leaned closer. Social media lit up instantly. Clips of the insult, replayed in real time, captions sparking debates, allies rushing to defend, opponents gloating with satisfaction. Yet there was an undercurrent, a question that spread through the crowd and the audience alike. How would he respond? The air was so charged that even the cameras seemed to hesitate, waiting to capture the exact second when the balance shifted. For in that pause, it was no longer about politics alone. It was about dignity, about whether arrogance could finally be silenced by calm resolve. The room was holding its breath. The nation was holding its breath. And just when the tension became unbearable, it happened. But no one expected what came next. The insult was still echoing when the energy inside the hall shifted. Reporters whispered into their recorders, anchors adjusted their microphones, and commentators backstage rushed to rewrite the narratives they thought they had prepared. This was no longer just another sparring match in front of cameras. It had become something larger, something charged with the weight of identity, history, and the fragile fabric of the American story itself. Every second that passed added pressure, as though the walls of the venue carried the anticipation of millions beyond it. This was not simply one man against another. It was arrogance against dignity, division against unity, belittlement against resilience. The moment mattered because of what it represented. Years of voices silenced, countless communities dismissed, and generations of struggle for recognition that too often met with mockery. In that instant, the stage became more than a podium. It became the reflection of a nation's contradictions. The stakes were no longer about who scored the cleverest line. The stakes were about who defined America's character in that very moment. Crowds watching from afar began to feel it. On living room couches, in bustling diners, on subway screens replaying the clip in endless loops, the insult struck nerves that ran deeper than politics. Parents who had once explained to their children why people sneered at their accents felt the sting again. Veterans who had returned home only to be told they did not belong clenched their fists. Students who had endured ridicule for where their families came from recognized the tone of that taunt. This was their story too, unfolding live on stage. And yet, while the nation trembled in anger, he stood steady. No raised voice, no instant retort, no stumble, just composure. It was a kind of strength that unsettled his opponent more than any words could. The cameras captured the villain's smirk beginning to falter, the restless shuffle of feet, the nervous laughter from supporters who expected dominance but now sensed danger. Because arrogance thrives on chaos, but it falters when faced with unshakable calm. What the audience did not yet realize was that this pause, this careful restraint, was strategy. He was not avoiding the insult. He was allowing its ugliness to expose itself. He was letting the nation see arrogance unmasked, giving everyone time to recognize the weight of what had just been said. In that silence, the villain's words began to rot in the air, becoming less clever and more cruel with every passing second. And that is why this moment mattered so deeply. It was no longer about personal pride or political points. It had become a trial in front of the entire country. Could dignity stand against humiliation? Could truth survive the storm of mockery? The outcome would ripple far beyond that stage, setting the tone for how millions saw themselves in a nation that often questioned their worth. As the tension reached its peak, the crowd seemed to lean forward, eyes locked on him, waiting for the answer. The silence was over. Something had to break. Something had to give. And just when the audience thought they understood the stakes, just when they thought they could predict what would follow, a deeper layer of the story began to reveal itself. Because before the hero's response could shake the nation, the spotlight first had to shift onto the man who thought he could not be touched. But what the world learned about him in that moment would change everything. To understand the weight of what happened on that stage, the nation needed to be reminded of who stood behind the insult. The man who threw it was not some unknown figure. He had been a constant shadow in American politics, a voice that thrived on spectacle, a presence that fed on division. His rise had been built not on quiet service or sacrifice, but on the sheer volume of his own voice and the endless appetite for controversy. He was a man who measured power in headlines, who believed that humiliation was a weapon, and who had mastered the art of turning outrage into fuel. From the beginning, his story was less about policy and more about performance. Crowds did not flock to him because of carefully constructed ideas, but because of the chaos he promised to deliver. He was the storm in every room he entered, relishing the gasps, the applause, and even the boos. To him, noise was victory, and silence was defeat. And that is why the moment on stage was so crucial, because silence, especially the kind of silence he faced that night, was the one force he never learned to control. His arrogance had long been his brand. He mocked opponents with nicknames designed to stick, reduced complex issues into sound bites sharp enough to cut, and prided himself on saying what others would not dare. Supporters hailed this as strength, a refusal to play by the rules of politeness. But to many others, it was nothing more than cruelty dressed up as honesty. It was not bravery to insult the vulnerable. It was not leadership to divide neighbors. It was not courage to speak over others until no voice but his own could be heard. Over the years, the villain had found ways to turn scandal into opportunity. Each time he crossed a line, his followers cheered louder. Each time he sparked outrage, the cameras could not look away. He understood that in the modern age, attention was currency, and he spent it lavishly. Yet beneath the showmanship was a man increasingly trapped by his own creation. The louder he became, the more silence threatened him. He could not allow space for reflection, because reflection revealed the emptiness behind the noise. And so, he lashed out. He belittled immigrants, questioning their worth. He mocked journalists who dared to question him. He sneered at veterans, at women, at anyone who stood in his way. Each insult was meant to be final. Each attack a reminder that he held the microphone. His followers saw dominance. His opponents saw insecurity. But on that stage, in that moment, the mask of confidence began to crack. The cameras caught what he tried to hide, the subtle twitch of impatience when his insult did not land with the crushing effect he expected, the flicker of unease when his opponent refused to crumble. He had built his career on confrontation, on knocking people off balance, on making them react. But what happens when the target refuses to play the part? What happens when arrogance meets dignity and finds itself shrinking instead of towering? The backstory mattered because this was not the first time he had underestimated someone who carried the voices of many. He had underestimated before, mocked before, ridiculed before, and in those moments he revealed more about himself than about anyone else. He revealed a man terrified of irrelevance, desperate to be heard, terrified of silence. The cruelty was not strength, it was fear disguised. For the audience that night, whether they supported him or despised him, the truth was undeniable. The insult said more about him than about the one it was aimed at. The cruelty exposed his weakness. The sneer exposed his insecurity. The performance exposed the fragility of a man who believed arrogance was power. And so, as the spotlight lingered on his face, as the crowd murmured and the tension tightened, the villain's carefully constructed image began to falter. This was not the commanding figure he wanted to appear as. This was a man on the edge of losing control of the stage, a man who had handed the nation the perfect view of his own unraveling. But if the villain's downfall was beginning to show, it was only because the hero's story was about to rise in its place, and the truth of who stood across from him, the dignity, the struggle, the resilience, would soon redefine the moment entirely. What made the insult unforgettable was not just the cruelty of the words, but the power of the one who received them. Because the story was never meant to belong to the villain, it was always meant to belong to the figure who had carried the weight of adversity and was about to show why silence can be more devastating than any insult. And just as the nation began to grasp the cracks in the villain's armor, attention shifted. The crowd wanted to know, who was the man who stood so calm, so composed, so unshaken? The answer lay in his story, the story of a hero forged by struggle, defined by sacrifice, and prepared for this very moment. Before the words that would shatter arrogance could be spoken, the nation needed to remember who stood in that silence, and why that silence carried the weight it did. Because this was not simply a politician on a stage. This was a man whose life had been shaped by battles that began long before the cameras ever turned toward him. His story was not about privilege or entitlement. His story was about perseverance. He had grown up hearing whispers that questioned his belonging, that mocked the very roots of his identity. In schoolyards, in classrooms, in the quiet corners, where children sometimes learn cruelty too young, he had felt the sting of being marked as different. But rather than shrinking, he carried those words with him, not as chains, but as fire. They became the silent promise that one day he would rise above those who doubted him, that one day the laughter would turn into applause. His family had carried sacrifices that were invisible to the world yet unforgettable to him. Parents who worked jobs that bent their backs and hardened their hands, never asking for recognition but demanding dignity. They believed in America, not because it was perfect, but because it promised that no struggle was wasted, no voice should be silenced, no child should grow believing they were less. From them he learned that true power was not in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. And so he walked a path that was never meant to be easy. The universities where he studied were not filled with faces like his. The halls of power where he later worked were never built for someone with his story. But at every step, he carried himself with the quiet defiance of someone who knew that presence itself was resistance. Every speech, every policy, every public appearance was more than politics. It was proof that resilience could not be erased. There had been moments when the burden felt unbearable. Nights when criticism poured in, not for what he did, but for who he was. Commentators questioning his faith, rivals mocking his name, opponents twisting his background into a weapon. Yet, through it all he did not respond with venom. He responded with composure, because he knew what his parents had taught him long ago. Anger burns fast, but dignity endures. And it was that dignity that made him more than just a candidate or a leader. It made him a symbol. To the immigrant mother working late into the night, he was proof that her sacrifices mattered. To the young student who felt invisible in a classroom, he was proof that difference could become strength. To the worker dismissed by arrogance, he was proof that respect could triumph over contempt. His very presence on that stage was an answer to generations of doubt. The night of the insult was not the first time he had been underestimated. Again and again, opponents had mistaken his calm for weakness. They thought his pauses were hesitation, his patience a flaw, but those who knew his journey understood differently. Every pause was calculation. Every silence was preparation. Every calm response was the echo of a lifetime spent enduring storms that would have broken lesser men. And so, when he stood on that stage, facing the arrogance of a man who believed cruelty was power, he was not just another politician trying to score points. He was the embodiment of a larger struggle. He was the face of every worker who had been sneered at, Every immigrant who had been told to go back, every child who had been laughed at for daring to dream. His story carried them all, and that was why the nation leaned in when he did not flinch. Even his critics, even those who disagreed with his politics, could not deny the strength in that silence. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a man who had seen worse insults, endured harsher storms, and refused to bend. That composure unnerved his opponent because arrogance has no defense against unshakable resolve. The villain's words had been sharp, but sharpness fails against someone whose skin has already been tempered by fire. And this was why the stakes felt so monumental. Because when he finally chose to speak, it would not simply be words spoken into a microphone. It would be history answering arrogance. It would be sacrifice answering privilege. It would be the long arc of dignity finally bending against mockery. But that response had not yet come. The nation was still waiting, the hall still buzzing with tension, the cameras still capturing the look of a man who stood calm against insult. What the audience did not yet know was that the silence was the setup, and the storm was about to break. Because the moment was approaching, the very second when calm composure would transform into a line so sharp, so devastating, that it would echo across screens, replayed in living rooms, debated on news panels, and etched into political memory. And while the villain believed the stage still belonged to him, the truth was undeniable. The story had shifted. The weight of the moment no longer rested in the arrogance of an insult. It rested in the dignity of the man who was about to answer. The silence would not last forever. It never does. But the words that would follow, they would change everything. The silence could not hold forever. Like thunder before a storm, the air vibrated with what was about to come. And then, the debate shifted. The villain, sensing that his insult had not landed with the devastating effect he intended, pressed harder. His voice rose above the murmurs of the crowd, each word carrying the desperate weight of someone trying to reassert control. He doubled down, throwing more jabs, more sneers, convinced that if he piled enough ridicule onto the stage, the composure of his opponent would crack. But it did not. Instead, the calm figure across from him only listened. The stillness grew louder with every insult, every attempt to provoke. Viewers at home could see the difference. On one side, a man pacing, gesturing wildly, sweating under the stage lights. On the other, someone steady, his face lit not with anger, but with something sharper, patience. The patience of someone who knew the crowd would soon see the truth for themselves. The moderator tried to interject, reminding them of the topic, urging civility, but the villain brushed it aside. He was hungry for dominance, unwilling to share the stage, determined to drown dignity with noise. The crowd split into two energies, cheers from loyal supporters echoing the arrogance, and gasps, murmurs, even boos from those who felt the sting of his words. It was chaos wrapped in performance, and yet the calm figure refused to bend into it. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. For while the villain raised his voice, he began to reveal too much. His arguments grew sloppy, his insults repetitive. The more he spoke, the more hollow his words became. He was not dismantling his opponent. He was unraveling himself. And the cameras, relentless and unkind, caught every moment. The flashes of irritation, the smirk fading into frustration, the desperate attempt to hold the room. Meanwhile, the hero leaned forward, finally moving after minutes of silence. The simple gesture caught the audience off guard. It was as though the world had tilted, as though gravity itself had shifted to his side. The hall quieted, straining to hear what he might say. But he did not speak yet. He let the tension build. He let the arrogance burn itself out. And with each second, the imbalance became clearer. One man flailing, the other preparing. At home, families watching the broadcast felt the energy too. Parents shook their heads at the arrogance they were seeing. Students replayed the clip of the insult, waiting for the counter. Social media boiled with commentary. When is he going to respond? He's waiting for the perfect moment. Watch, he's about to flip this entire debate. The anticipation turned into obsession. Every eye was locked on the calm figure who had yet to unleash a single line. The villain, sensing that grip slipping, pushed harder still. His voice cracked. His tone sharpened, but the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. The debate had moved beyond words. It had become a battle of presence, of composure, of who would own the silence between sentences. And in that arena, the villain was losing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of noise, the hero straightened his posture and fixed his eyes on his opponent. The room stilled. The nation stilled. This was it. The turning point everyone had been waiting for. The moment when silence would finally give way to the words that could not be forgotten. But before he spoke, there was one more beat. One more pause that dragged the tension to its breaking point. A silence so profound it made the villain's rambling collapse into nothing. A silence that reminded the country that real strength is not measured by volume, but by timing. And when he finally opened his mouth, when the words began to rise, the world leaned closer, because what came next would not just answer an insult, it would redefine the entire night. The silence that followed the challenger's question was unlike anything heard in that chamber before. For a moment, the arrogance on the opponent's face froze, as if the weight of the words had struck deeper than expected. The crowd, once restless, leaned in as though gravity itself had pulled them toward the stage. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the nation itself was perched on the edge of its seat, waiting for the balance to break. Then came the response, not with shouting, not with rage, but with a voice that carried steel wrapped in velvet. "You call us outsiders," he began, his eyes sweeping across the audience, locking on faces both sympathetic and skeptical. "You call us weak. You call us unworthy of standing here. But what you forget is that this country was not built by those who excluded. It was built by those who endured." His words dropped one by one like hammers striking an unbreakable wall, each syllable challenging the foundation of his opponent's claim. The opponent shifted uncomfortably, the grin fading. It was clear the insult had backfired, but the challenger was only beginning. "You speak of strength as though it belongs to you alone," he continued, his tone rising with each phrase. "But strength is the mother who works 3 jobs and still tucks her children into bed with hope. Strength is the father who crossed oceans and borders with nothing but the dream of a better life. Strength is every voice that was told to sit down but stood up anyway." The chamber erupted in applause, thunderous and unrelenting, drowning out the opponent's attempt to interject. Viewers at home felt it too, the surge of vindication, the validation of being seen, being named, being honored in a space that had so long tried to erase them. This was not just a rebuttal, it was a reclamation. And then, with deliberate precision, the challenger turned directly to the man who had thrown the insult. "You think your words can shame us?" he asked, his tone cutting but steady. "You cannot shame those who already carry scars. You cannot silence those who have been silent." The crowd no longer respected his command. They had chosen their side. Cameras captured every second. The opponent's face red with rage, the challenger standing tall in calm defiance, the crowd roaring as if centuries of silence were finally being undone. The opponent's voice cracked as he tried once more. "Order! I demand order!" But no one listened. The tide had turned completely. For the first time, he was not feared. He was not admired. He was not even heard. The challenger stood still, watching, letting the chaos prove his point. He did not need to speak anymore. The people were speaking for him. And in that instant, everyone knew. The old balance of power had shattered. Something new had begun. The chamber was silent now, the air so heavy it felt as if history itself was pressing down on the walls. Every insult, every clash, every revelation of the night had led to this singular point. One figure, standing taller than before, finally broke the silence with words that were not shouted, but spoken with a calm that carried more force than fury ever could. They said, in essence, that this was never about them, never about one person winning over another, but about the generations watching, about the young girl gripping her mother's hand in the gallery, waiting to see if her identity would be affirmed or denied, about the immigrant father who had given up everything only to be told he did not belong, about the millions who had been silenced too long, waiting for someone to say what they always knew was true, that dignity was not negotiable and belonging was not conditional. As the words rolled out, the chamber seemed to shrink. The villain, who had strutted so confidently at the beginning, now sat still, unable to meet the gaze that was fixed directly upon them. Their power, so blinding only hours before, now looked brittle, like glass ready to shatter. And the hero's final declaration landed not like a speech, but like a verdict. The people who built this country could no longer be erased from its story. For a heartbeat there was no sound, only the thundering silence of realization. Then, slowly, applause began. Hesitant at first, then spreading, rising, until the hall shook with it. Not everyone clapped. Some sat frozen in defiance, but their stillness only underscored how the tide had turned. The camera of history panned outward, from the hero's steady face, to the crowd of voices roaring for justice, to the nation itself, watching breathless from screens in kitchens, dorm rooms, and break rooms across the land. The final word had been spoken, but its echo was only beginning to travel. And as the night closed, one line hung suspended in the air, sharper and clearer than anything else. This was not the end of a debate. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The chamber lights dimmed, but the story burned brighter than ever, because everyone now understood deep in their bones that nothing would ever be the same again.